thought grief was going to change my life, but what I didn't expect was that it would change how I paint. Over the last 9 months, I rebuilt my creative process from the ground up. Today, I'm painting my ball python as the Bloomkeeper, the warden of the lilies in the realm of the stillness in my universe called the Veilgarden, all while showing you the technical changes I've made in my painting process, from gradient mapping to edge control to value contrast. One of the hardest parts of being an artist isn't learning new techniques, it's recognizing when the techniques you've used for your whole life are no longer helping you grow. For the last several months, I experienced the biggest upheaval of my entire life, between moving, starting a new job at a new hospital, navigating mycosis fungoides, and grieving the version of life that I thought I was building. I stopped asking how to paint faster and better. I started asking different questions. If my time is finite, and none of us know how finite, then I want every painting that I do to be intentional. I want every action I make to be intentional. That doesn't just change the way that I interact with people, it changes how I look at a blade of grass, how I care for my patients, how I build relationships, and eventually it changed the way I paint too. Becoming more intentional in my life made me become more intentional in the way that I pursue my paintings. Instead of just slapping on some color, I gave myself some structure. Instead of giving everything hard edges, I learned where in the composition to intentionally soften edges. Instead of having high contrast everywhere, I became more intentional about where in the composition I had high contrast. Hidden in the way that I paint is a philosophy on life, if you will. I'm Selena, the artist behind CMC Fine Art, and I've been doing art for over 15 years. And I realized that I changed too. My art shifted. This isn't just a speed paint today. It's the first painting that feels like the beginning of a new chapter. I just stopped sharing for a little bit. I didn't stop painting. It's been about 9 months since I posted last. I painted Nikita Mosswhisker, our resident entomologist, Brecken, excuse my terrible German that I don't actually speak, who is a monk at the Monastery of the Whispering Stones. And I painted a nudibranch, an anthropomorphic nudibranch, who is in a position of devotion. These weren't random pieces. They were me trying to get back to a good place where I wanted to draw. Historically, I built my paintings from establishing the local color first and then building the painting outward from the color palette. Snake is green, red shadows. Flower is yellow, purple shadows. Push saturation, add some highlights, call it done. And it worked for most of my life, but it's really kept me thinking like an illustrator, and it has kept me from truly understanding values. With my Bloomkeeper piece, I focused entirely on painting him in grayscale first, which is a technique that a lot of master artists used as well, called Grisaille. That way I could focus purely on the form, the structure, the values. I won't have any psychological tricks played on me by the colors. If the value doesn't hold, the painting doesn't hold. Once the structure was all in place, I had all the values where I wanted them, then I was able to use a gradient map. I learned about gradient maps from one of my favorite artists. His name is Peter Moorbacher. Super amazing. And so basically, with the gradient map, each value corresponds to an appropriate color of appropriate value. And so with that natural gradient mapping, it makes the coloring process a lot easier. And that's a good baseline. So if you need to make any additional tiny tweaks, then you can do that as an extra layer on top, just for minor corrections. Dark values receive one hue, dark values receive one temperature,
and midtones, another highlights an entirely different one altogether. It forced me to be more intentional, and I didn't have to think so hard about which color fit the correct value and which color fit the correct temperature as well. I was able to do that a little bit more in post-processing as an adjustment instead of having to struggle through the entire time from the beginning. I used to jump straight into pretty chromatic shadows because I was historically told by all of my teachers, like, you're allergic to values, like, you need to push your values, make your darks darker and your lights lighter. So in my paintings, I use a lot of dioxazine purple, phthalo green, phthalo blue to make my shadows. However, what that ended up doing is, yes, there was significant contrast. However, the contrast is then without any discrimination all throughout the piece. And so in order to draw the viewer's eye to areas that are of higher importance, I experimented with keeping the high value contrast areas to the places of higher focus, like where we should be fixing our gaze. And so I will let the color temperature changes do some work there as well elsewhere in the piece. So reserving those dramatic contrast shifts to high focus areas and letting some of the edges dissolve in areas where are less high focus, as well as using color temperature shifts to add a little bit of separation, but not as intensely as the areas of main focus. Likewise, with the edges, I wanted to experiment with controlling my edges more. So what I noticed in my paintings is that I have some pretty hard edges, and I have started to soften some of them with the mediums that I use. It makes it a little bit easier to kind of brush out and feather some of the edges by being able to slow down the drying acrylic. However, now I need to be more intentional with my edges so that I can again lead the viewer through the piece with the composition. And so if you notice, I have some softer edges at the top of the head and some softer edges fading out towards the back of the piece as the body goes off page. I have higher contrast and sharper edges around the eye, which is where I wanted the focal point of the composition to really truly be. Even the flowers do have, firmer edges. However, they're not as outlined, nor is the contrast as high as it is on the iris itself. If you also notice in the background, the colors, the color palette and the choices are a lot softer in color, and they're also compressed in terms of values. So I don't have that huge value contrast the way that I do closer to the eye and in the face and the body, which is where I want the viewer to be predominantly looking. As far as the background goes, I did paint that pretty traditionally as I have before. I didn't do the background in grayscale. That was able to be a little bit more organic. I don't feel that I needed to work so hard to identify values because I was using a pretty narrow band of value ranges anyway, so I was able to use color pretty indiscriminately and more based off of vibes. It's also a little bit more abstract than I normally do, so that was very enjoyable. I was able to paint more expressively from how I'm feeling, and I think that really adds a lot of character to the piece as well. I also chose my colors in the positions of the background intentionally because we want to be able to have the subject pop out at least a little bit from the foreground. So if you have a section that's closer towards the viewer, you want there to be a little bit more of that contrast and a harder edge, and you do that by both color temperature and also in terms of value. So if I have a bright object in the foreground, then I'll have a darker object, darker color in the background to make that pop a little bit. If, however, I have a part of the, let's say, a character is tilting backwards, then that top away from the viewer, then the top part of the, let's say, their head is going to have softer edges and blur out into the background without necessarily having such a huge contrast in terms of values, because we want those edges to dissolve, we want the object to start to dissolve, and that is one of the tricks that we use to do that. There's something stabilizing about separating the structure and the values from color. You get the bones right first, then you can layer the emotions on afterward. And we can decide to lose definition in certain places. Growth isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's quiet calibration. Some changes are smooth, some changes are asymmetrical, and some take time to reveal what all changes, and some take time to reveal what all impact they truly make. I'm not going to narrate all of it, but I will say that slowing down and appreciating all things big or small has changed how I respond to friction in life and in painting. You stop forcing contrast, you start observing it and molding it. I'm not abandoning illustration. I'm integrating more value structure into it moving forward. More edge awareness, more temperature awareness, and more value discipline. If you stay, you're going to watch my style evolve in real time. Not dramatically, deliberately. If you like my content and if you like my journey and you want to know more, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for still being here after 9 months. Not restarting, I'm refining.